Chapter 3, Part 2 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devora Allen. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2, by Charles Mackay. Chapter 3, The Slow Poisoners, Part 2. In the second volume of the Harleian Miscellany there is a tract entitled The Forerunner of Revenge, written by George Eglisham, Doctor of Medicine, and one of the physicians to King James. Harris, in quoting it, says that it is full of rancour and prejudice. It is evidently exaggerated, but forms nevertheless a link in the chain of evidence. Eglisham says, the king being sick of an ague, the Duke took this opportunity, when all the king's doctors of physic were at dinner, and offered to him a white powder to take, the which he a long time refused, but overcome with his flattering importunity, he took it in wine, and immediately became worse and worse, falling into many swoonings and pains, and violent fluxes of the belly, so tormented, that his majesty cried out aloud of this white powder, "Would to God I had never taken it!" He then tells us of the Countess of Buckingham, the Duke's mother, applying the plaster to the king's heart and breast, whereupon he grew faint and short-breathed, and in agony; that the physicians exclaimed that the king was poisoned; that Buckingham commanded them out of the room, and committed one of them close prisoner to his own chamber, and another to be removed from court; and that after his majesty's death, his body and head swelled above measure; his hair, with the skin of his head, stuck to his pillow, and his nails became loose on his fingers and toes. Clarendon, who, by the way, was a partisan of the Duke's, gives a totally different account of James's death. He says, "It was occasioned by an ague, after a short indisposition by the gout, which, meeting many humours in a fat unwieldy body of 58 years old, in 4 or 5 fits carried him out of the world; after whose death many scandalous and libellous discourses were raised, without the least colour or ground, as appeared upon the strictest and most malicious examination that could be made, long after, in a time of licence when nobody was afraid of offending majesty, and when prosecuting the highest reproaches and contumelies against the royal family was held very meritorious." Notwithstanding this confident declaration, the world will hardly be persuaded that there was not some truth in the rumours that were abroad. The inquiries which were instituted were not as strict as he asserts, and all the unconstitutional influence of the powerful favourite was exerted to defeat them. In the celebrated accusations brought against Buckingham by the Earl of Bristol, the poisoning of King James was placed last on the list, and the pages of history bear evidence of the summary mode in which they were, for the time, got rid of. The man from whom Buckingham is said to have procured his poisons was one Dr. Lamb, a conjurer and empiric, who, besides dealing in poisons, pretended to be a fortune-teller. The popular fury which broke with comparative harmlessness against his patron was directed against this man, until he could not appear with safety in the streets of London. His fate was melancholy. Walking one day in Cheapside, disguised, as he thought, from all observers, he was recognized by some idle boys, who began to hoot and pelt him with stones, calling out, "The poisoner! The poisoner! Down with the wizard! Down with him!" A mob very soon collected, and the doctor took to his heels and ran for his life. He was pursued and seized in Wood Street, and from thence dragged by the hair through the mire to St. Paul's Cross, the mob beating him with sticks and stones, and calling out, "Kill the wizard! Kill the poisoner!" Charles I, on hearing of the riot, rode from Whitehall to quell it, but he arrived too late to save the victim. Every bone in his body was broken, and he was quite dead. Charles was excessively indignant, and fined the city £600 for its inability to deliver up the ringleaders to justice. But it was in Italy that poisoning was most prevalent. From a very early period it seems to have been looked upon in that country as a perfectly justifiable means of getting rid of an enemy. The Italians of the 16th and 17th centuries poisoned their opponents with as little compunction as an Englishman of the present day brings an action at law against anyone who has done him an injury. The writings of contemporary authors inform us that, when La Spara and La Tofania carried on their infernal trade, ladies put poison bottles on their dressing tables as openly, and used them with as little scruple upon others, as modern dames use eau de cologne or lavender water upon themselves. So powerful is the influence of fashion, it can even cause murder to be regarded as a venial peccadillo. In the Memoirs of the last Duke of Guise, who made a quixotic attempt, in 1648, to seize upon the government of Naples, we find some curious particulars relative to the popular feeling with regard to poisoning. A man named Gennaro Anise, who, after the short and extraordinary career of Masaniello the fisherman, had established himself as a sort of captain general of the populace, rendered himself so obnoxious to the Duke of Guise that the adherents of the latter determined to murder him. The captain of the guard, as the Duke himself very coolly informs us, was requested to undertake this office. It was suggested to him that the poniard would be the most effectual instrument, but the man turned up his eyes with pious horror at the proposition. He was ready to poison Gennaro Anise whenever he might be called upon to do so, but to poniard him, he said, would be disgraceful, and unbecoming an officer of the guards. At last poison was agreed upon, and Agostino Mola, an attorney in the Duke's confidence, brought the bottle containing the liquid to show it to his master. The following is the Duke's own account. Agostino came to me at night, and told me, "I have brought you something which will free you from Gennaro. He deserves death, and it is no great matter after what fashion justice is done upon him. Look at this vial, full of clear and beautiful water. In 4 days' time it will punish all his treasons. The captain of the guard has undertaken to give it him, and as it has no taste at all, Gennaro will suspect nothing." The Duke further informs us that the dose was duly administered, but that Gennaro, fortunately for himself, ate nothing for dinner that day but cabbage dressed with oil, which, acting as an antidote, caused him to vomit profusely and saved his life. He was exceedingly ill for 5 days, but never suspected that he had been poisoned. In process of time, poison vending became a profitable trade. 11 years after this period, it was carried on at Rome to such an extent that the sluggish government was roused to interference. Beckmann, in his History of Inventions, and Lebray, in his Magazin zum Gebrauche der Staatenkirche Geschichte, or Magazine of Materials for a History of a State Church, relates that, in the year 1659, it was made known to Pope Alexander VII that great numbers of young women had avowed in the confessional that they had poisoned their husbands with slow poisons. The Catholic clergy, who in general hold the secrets of the confessional so sacred, were shocked and alarmed at the extraordinary prevalence of the crime. Although they refrained from revealing the names of the penitents, they conceived themselves bound to apprise the head of the Church of the enormities that were practised. It was also the subject of general conversation in Rome that young widows were unusually abundant. It was remarked, too, that if any couple lived unhappily together, the husband soon took ill and died. The papal authorities, when once they began to inquire, soon learned that a society of young wives had been formed, and met nightly for some mysterious purpose, at the house of an old woman named Hieronyma Spara. This hag was a reputed witch and fortune-teller, and acted as president of the young viragos, several of whom, it was afterward ascertained, belonged to the first families of Rome. In order to have positive evidence of the practices of this female conclave, a lady was employed by the government to seek an interview with them. She dressed herself out in the most magnificent style, and having been amply provided with money, she found but little difficulty, when she had stated her object, of procuring an audience of La Spara and her sisterhood. She pretended to be in extreme distress of mind on account of the infidelities and ill treatment of her husband, and implored La Spara to furnish her with a few drops of the wonderful elixir, the efficacy of which in sending cruel husbands to their last long sleep was so much vaunted by the ladies of Rome. La Spara fell into the snare, and sold her some of her drops at a price commensurate with the supposed wealth of the purchaser. The liquor thus obtained was subjected to an analysis, and found to be, as was suspected, a slow poison, clear, tasteless, and limpid, like that spoken of by the Duke of Guise. Upon this evidence, the house was surrounded by the police, and La Spara and her companions taken into custody. La Spara, who is described as having been a little ugly old woman, was put to the torture, but obstinately refused to confess her guilt. Another of the women, named La Gratiosa, had less firmness, and laid bare all the secrets of the infernal sisterhood. Taking a confession extorted by anguish on the rack at its true value, nothing at all, there is still sufficient evidence to warrant posterity in the belief of their guilt. They were found guilty and condemned, according to their degrees of culpability, to various punishments. La Spara, Gratiosa, and 3 young women, who had poisoned their husbands, were hanged together at Rome. Upwards of 30 women were whipped publicly through the streets, and several, whose high rank screened them from more degrading punishment, were banished from the country, and mulcted in heavy fines. In a few months afterwards, 9 women more were hanged for poisoning, and another bevy, including many young and beautiful girls, were whipped half naked through the streets of Rome. This severity did not put a stop to the practice, and jealous women and avaricious men, anxious to step into the inheritance of fathers, uncles, or brothers, resorted to poison. As it was quite free from taste, colour, and smell, it was administered without exciting suspicion. The skilful vendors compounded it of different degrees of strength, so that the poisoners had only to say whether they wanted their victims to die in a week, a month, or 6 months, and they were suited with corresponding doses. The vendors were chiefly women, of whom the most celebrated was a hag named Tophania, who was in this way accessory to the death of upwards of 600 persons. This woman appears to have been a dealer in poisons from her girlhood, and resided first at Palermo and then at Naples. That entertaining traveller, Father Labat, has given, in his Letters from Italy, many curious particulars relating to her. When he was at Civita Vecchia in 1719, the Viceroy of Naples discovered that poison was extensively sold in the latter city, and that it went by the name of aqueta, or little water. On making further inquiry, he ascertained that Tophania, who was by that time near 70 years of age, and who seems to have begun her evil courses very soon after the execution of La Spara, sent large quantities of it to all parts of Italy in small vials, with the inscription, Manna of St. Nicholas of Bari. The tomb of St. Nicholas of Bari was celebrated throughout Italy. A miraculous oil was said to ooze from it, which cured nearly all the maladies that flesh is heir to, provided the recipient made use of it with the due degree of faith. La Tophania artfully gave this name to her poison to elude the vigilance of the custom-house officers, who, in common with everybody else, had a pious respect for St. Nicholas de Bari and his wonderful oil. The poison was similar to that manufactured by La Spara. Hahnemann the physician, and father of the homeopathic doctrine, writing upon this subject, says it was compounded of arsenic neutral salts, occasioning in the victim a gradual loss of appetite, faintness, gnawing pains in the stomach, loss of strength, and wasting of the lungs. The Abbé Gagliardi says that a few drops of it were generally poured into tea, chocolate, or soup, and its effects were slow, and almost imperceptible. Gorelli, physician to the Emperor of Austria, in a letter to Hoffmann, says it was crystallized arsenic, dissolved in a large quantity of water by decoction, with the addition, for some unexplained purpose, of the herb Cymbellaria. The Neapolitans called it aqua tophnina, and it became notorious all over Europe under the name of aqua tophania. Although this woman carried on her infamous traffic so extensively, it was extremely difficult to meet with her. She lived in continual dread of discovery. She constantly changed her name and residence, and pretending to be a person of great godliness, resided in monasteries for months together. Whenever she was more than usually apprehensive of detection, she sought ecclesiastical protection. She was soon apprised of the search made for her by the Viceroy of Naples, and, according to her practice, took refuge in a monastery. Either the search after her was not very rigid, or her measures were exceedingly well taken, for she contrived to elude the vigilance of the authorities for several years. What is still more extraordinary, as showing the ramifications of her system, her trade was still carried on to as great an extent as before. Labat informs us that she had so great a sympathy for poor wives who hated their husbands and wanted to get rid of them, but could not afford to buy her wonderful aqua, that she made them presents of it. She was not allowed, however, to play at this game for ever. She was at length discovered in a nunnery, and her retreat cut off. The Viceroy made several representations to the Superior to deliver her up, but without effect. The abbess, supported by the archbishop of the diocese, constantly refused. The public curiosity was in consequence so much excited at the additional importance thus thrust upon the criminal, that thousands of persons visited the nunnery in order to catch a glimpse of her. The patience of the viceroy appears to have been exhausted by these delays. Being a man of sense, and not a very zealous Catholic, he determined that even the Church should not shield a criminal so atrocious. Setting the privileges of the nunnery at defiance, he sent a troop of soldiers, who broke over the walls and carried her away viet armis. The archbishop, Cardinal Pignatelli, was highly indignant, and threatened to excommunicate and lay the whole city under interdict. All the inferior clergy, animated by the esprit du corps, took up the question, and so worked upon the superstitious and bigoted people, that they were ready to rise in a mass to storm the palace of the viceroy and rescue the prisoner. These were serious difficulties, but the viceroy was not a man to be daunted. Indeed, he seems to have acted throughout with a rare union of astuteness, coolness, and energy. To avoid the evil consequences of the threatened excommunication, he placed a guard round the palace of the archbishop, judging that the latter would not be so foolish as to launch out an anathema which would cause the city to be starved, and himself in it. The market people would not have dared to come to the city with provisions so long as it remained under the ban. There would have been too much inconvenience to himself and his ghostly brethren in such a measure, and as the viceroy anticipated, the good cardinal reserved his thunders for some other occasion. Still there was the populace. To quiet their clamour and avert the impending insurrection, the agents of the government adroitly mingled with the people, and spread abroad a report that Tophania had poisoned all the wells and fountains of the city. This was enough. The popular feeling was turned against her immediately. Those who, but a moment before, had looked upon her as a saint, now reviled her as a devil, and were as eager for her punishment as they had before been for her escape. Tophania was then put to the torture. She confessed the long catalogue of her crimes, and named all the persons who had employed her. She was shortly afterwards strangled, and her corpse thrown over the wall into the garden of the convent from whence she had been taken. This appears to have been done to conciliate the clergy, by allowing them at least the burial of one who had taken refuge within their precincts. After her death, the mania for poisoning seems to have abated, but we have yet to see what hold it took upon the French people at a somewhat earlier period. So rooted had it become in France between the years 1670 and 1680, that Madame de Sévigné, in one of her letters, expresses her fear that Frenchman and poisoner would become synonymous terms. As in Italy, the first notice the government received of the prevalence of this crime was given by the clergy, to whom females of high rank, and some among the middle and lower classes, had avowed in the confessional that they had poisoned their husbands. In consequence of these disclosures, 2 Italians, named Exili and Glaser, were arrested, and thrown into the Bastille on the charge of compounding and selling the drugs used for these murders. Glaser died in prison, but Exili remained without trial for several months, and there, shortly afterwards, he made the acquaintance of another prisoner, named Sainte Croix, by whose example the crime was still further disseminated among the French people. End of Chapter 3, Part 2.
Chapter 3, Part 3 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay, Volume 2, Chapter 3, The Slow Poisoners, Part 3. The most notorious of the poisoners that derived their pernicious knowledge from this man was Madame de Brinvilliers, a young woman connected by both birth and marriage with some of the noblest families of France. She seems from her very earliest years to have been heartless and depraved, and if we may believe her own confession, was steeped in wickedness ere she had well entered her teens. She was, however, beautiful and accomplished, and in the eye of the world seemed exemplary and kind. Guyot de Pideval, in the Causes Célèbres, and Madame de Sévigné, in her letters, represent her as mild and agreeable in her manners, and offering no traces on her countenance of the evil soul within. She was married in 1651 to the Marquis de Brinvilliers, with whom she lived unhappily for some years. He was a loose, dissipated character, and was the means of introducing Sainte Croix to his wife, a man who cast a blight upon her life, and dragged her on from crime to crime, till her offences became so great that the mind shudders to dwell upon them. For this man she conceived a guilty passion, to gratify which she plunged at once into the gulf of sin. She was drawn to its most loathsome depths ere retribution overtook her. She had as yet shown a fair outside to the world, and found but little difficulty in effecting a legal separation from her husband, who had not the art to conceal his vices. The proceeding gave great offence to her family. She appears after this to have thrown off the mask completely, and carried on her intrigues so openly with her lover Sainte Croix, that her father, Monsieur d'Aubray, scandalized at her conduct, procured a lettre de cachet, and had him imprisoned in the Bastille for a 12-month. Sainte Croix, who had been in Italy, was a dabbler in poisons. He knew something of the secrets of the detestable Laspara, and improved himself in them from the instructions of Exili, with whom he speedily contracted a sort of friendship. By him he was shown how to prepare not only the liquid poisons employed in Italy, but that known as succession powder, which afterwards became so celebrated in France. Like his mistress, he appeared amiable, witty, and intelligent, and showed no signs to the world of the two fierce passions, revenge and avarice, which were gnawing at his heart. Both these passions were to be sated on the unfortunate family of d'Aubray: his revenge because they had imprisoned him, and his avarice because they were rich. Reckless and extravagant, he was always in want of money, and he had no one to supply him but Madame de Brinvilliers, whose own portion was far from sufficient to satisfy his need. Groaning to think that any impediment should stand between him and wealth, he conceived the horrid idea of poisoning Monsieur d'Aubray, her father, and her two brothers, that she might inherit the property. 3 murders were nothing to such a villain. He communicated his plan to Madame de Brinvilliers, and she, without the slightest scruple, agreed to aid him. He undertook to compound the poisons, and she to administer them. The zeal and alacrity with which she set to work seem hardly credible. Sainte Croix found her an apt scholar, and she soon became as expert as himself in the manufacture of poisons. To try the strength of the first doses, she used to administer them to dogs, rabbits, and pigeons. Afterwards, wishing to be more certain of their effects, she went round to the hospitals and administered them to the sick poor in the soups which she brought in apparent charity. This is denied by Voltaire in his Age of Louis XIV, but he does not state for what reason. His words are: Il est fauquel yo essaie ces poisons dans l'hospital, comme le deste la people, et comme il est écrit dans la cause célèbre, ouvrage d'un advocat sans cause et faire pour la people. None of the poisons were intended to kill at the first dose, so that she could try them once upon an individual without fear of murder. She tried the same atrocious experiment upon the guests at her father's table, by poisoning a pigeon pie. To be more certain still, she next poisoned herself. When convinced by this desperate essay of the potency of the draught, she procured an antidote from Sainte Croix, and, all doubts being removed, commenced operations upon her grey-headed father. She administered the first dose with her own hands in his chocolate. The poison worked well. The old man was taken ill, and his daughter, apparently full of tenderness and anxiety, watched by his bedside. The next day she gave him some broth, which she recommended as highly nourishing. This also was poisoned. In this manner she gradually wore out his frame, and in less than 10 days he was a corpse. His death seemed so much the result of disease that no suspicions were excited. When the 2 brothers arrived from the provinces to render the last sad duties to their sire, they found their sister as grieved to all outward appearance as even filial affection could desire. But the young men only came to perish. They stood between Sainte Croix and the already half-clutched gold, and their doom was sealed. A man named La Chaussée was hired by Sainte Croix to aid in administering the poisons, and in less than 6 weeks' time they had both gone to their long home. Suspicion was now excited, but so cautiously had all been done that it found no one upon whom to attach itself. The marquise had a sister, and she was entitled by the death of her relatives to half the property. Less than the whole would not satisfy Sainte Croix, and he determined that she should die the same death as her father and brothers. She was too distrustful, however, and by quitting Paris she escaped the destruction that was lurking for her. The marquise had undertaken these murders to please her lover. She was now anxious to perpetrate another on her own account. She wished to marry Sainte Croix, but though separated from her husband, she was not divorced. She thought it would be easier to poison him than to apply to the tribunals for a divorce, which might perhaps be refused. But Sainte Croix had no longer any love for his guilty instrument. Bad men do not admire others who are as bad as themselves. Though a villain himself, he had no desire to marry one, and was not at all anxious for the death of the marquis. He seemed, however, to enter into the plot, and supplied her with poison for her husband, but he took care to provide a remedy. La Brinvilliers poisoned him one day, and Sainte Croix gave him an antidote the next. In this matter he was buffeted about between them for some time, and finally escaped with a ruined constitution and a broken heart. But the day of retribution was at hand, and a terrible mischance brought the murders to light. The nature of the poisons compounded by Sainte Croix was so deadly that when working in his laboratory he was obliged to wear a mask to preserve himself from suffocation. One day the mask slipped off, and the miserable wretch perished in his crimes. His corpse was found on the following morning in the obscure lodging where he had fitted up his laboratory. As he appeared to be without friends or relatives, the police took possession of his effects. Among other things was found a small box, to which was affixed the following singular document: "I humbly beg that those into whose hands this box may fall will do me the favour to deliver it into the hands only of the Marchioness de Brinvilliers, who resides in the Rue Neuve Saint Paul, as everything it contains concerns her and belongs to her alone, and as, besides, there is nothing in it that can be of use to any person but her. In case she shall be dead before me, it is my wish that it be burned with everything it contains, without opening or altering anything. In order that no one may plead ignorance, I swear by the God that I adore, and by all that is held most sacred, that I assert nothing but the truth, and if my intentions, just and reasonable as they are, be thwarted in this point by any persons, I charge their consciences with it, both in this world and that which is to come, in order that I may unload mine. I protest that this is my last will. Done at Paris, May 25th, 1672. Signed, Sainte Croix." This earnest solicitation, instead of ensuring respect as was intended, excited curiosity. The box was opened, and found to contain some papers and several vials and powders. The latter were handed to a chemist for analysis, and the documents were retained by the police and opened. Among them was found a promissory note of the Marchioness de Brinvilliers for 30,000 francs to the order of Sainte Croix. The other papers were of greater importance, as they implicated both her and her servant, La Chaussée, in the recent murders. As soon as she was informed of the death of Sainte Croix, she made an attempt to gain possession of his papers in the box, but being refused, she saw that there was no time to be lost, and immediately quitted. Next morning the police were on her trail, but she succeeded in escaping to England. La Chaussée was not so fortunate. Altogether ignorant of the fatal mischance which had brought his villainies to light, he did not dream of danger. He was arrested and brought to trial. Being put to the torture, he confessed that he had administered poison to the Messieurs d'Aubray, and that he received 100 pistoles, and the promise of an annuity for life, from Sainte Croix and Madame de Brinvilliers for the job. He was condemned to be broken alive on the wheel, and the Marchioness was, by default, sentenced to be beheaded. He was executed accordingly in March 1673, on the Place de Grève in Paris. La Brinvilliers appears to have resided for nearly 3 years in England. Early in 1676, thinking that the rigour of pursuit was over, and that she might venture to return to the Continent, she proceeded secretly to Liège. Notwithstanding her care, the French authorities were soon apprised of her return, and arrangements were promptly made with the municipality of that city to permit the agents of the French police to arrest her within the limits of their jurisdiction. De Grey, an officer of the Maréchaussée, accordingly left Paris for that purpose. On his arrival in Liège, he found that she had sought shelter within the walls of a convent. Here the arm of the law, long as it is said to be, could not reach her. But de Grey was not a man to be baffled, and he resorted to a stratagem to accomplish what force could not. Having disguised himself as a priest, he sought admission to the convent and obtained an interview with La Brinvilliers. He said that, being a Frenchman and passing through Liège, he could not leave the city without paying a visit to a lady whose beauty and misfortunes were so celebrated. Her vanity was flattered by the compliment. De Grey saw, to use a vulgar but forcible expression, that he had got on the blind side of her, and he adroitly continued to pour out the language of love and admiration, till the deluded Marchioness was thrown completely off her guard. She agreed, without much solicitation, to meet him outside the walls of the convent, where their amorous intrigue might be carried on more conveniently than within. Faithful to her appointment with her supposed new lover, she came, and found herself not in the embrace of a gallant, but in the custody of a policeman. Her trial was not long delayed. The proofs against her were abundant. The dying declaration of La Chaussée would have been alone enough to convict her, but besides that there were the mysterious document attached to the box of St. Croix, her flight from France, and, stronger and more damning proof than all, a paper in her own handwriting found among the effects of St. Croix, in which she detailed to him the misdeeds of her life, and spoke of the murder of her father and brothers, in terms that left no doubt of her guilt. During the trial all Paris was in commotion. La Brinvilliers was the only subject of conversation. All the details of her crimes were published and greedily devoured, and the idea of secret poisoning first put into the heads of hundreds, who afterwards became guilty of it. On the 16th of July, 1676, the Superior Criminal Court of Paris pronounced a verdict of guilty against her, for the murder of her father and brothers, and the attempt upon the life of her sister. She was condemned to be drawn on a hurdle, with her feet bare, a rope about her neck, and a burning torch in her hand, to the great entrance of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, where she was to make the amende honourable in the sight of all the people, to be taken from thence to the Place de Grève, and there to be beheaded. Her body was afterwards to be burned, and her ashes scattered to the winds. After her sentence she made a full confession of her guilt. She seems to have looked upon death without fear, but it was recklessness, not courage, that supported her. Madame de Sévigné says that when on the hurdle, on her way to the scaffold, she entreated her confessor to exert his influence with the executioner to place himself next to her, that his body might hide from her view the scoundrel de Grey who had entrapped her. She also asked the ladies who had been drawn to their windows to witness the procession what they were looking at, adding, "A pretty sight you have come to see, truly." She laughed when on the scaffold, dying as she had lived, impenitent and heartless. On the morrow the populace came in crowds to collect her ashes, to preserve them as relics. She was regarded as a martyred saint, and her ashes were supposed to be endowed by divine grace and the power of curing all diseases. Popular folly has often canonized persons whose pretensions to sanctity were extremely equivocal, but the disgusting folly of the multitude in this instance has never been surpassed. Before her death, proceedings were instituted against M. de Penautier, treasurer of the province of Languedoc, and receiver general for the clergy, who was accused by a lady named St. Laurent of having poisoned her husband, the late receiver general, in order to obtain his appointment. The circumstances of this case were never divulged, and the greatest influence was exerted to prevent it from going to trial. He was known to have been intimate with St. Croix and Madame de Brinvilliers, and was thought to have procured his poisons from them. The latter, however, refused to say anything which might implicate him. The inquiry was eventually stifled after Penautier had been several months in the Bastille. The Cardinal de Bonzy was accused by the gossips of the day of being an accomplice of Penautier. The cardinal's estates were burdened with the payment of several heavy annuities, but about the time that poisoning became so fashionable, all the annuitants died off one after the other. The cardinal, in talking of these annuitants, afterwards used to say, "Thanks to my star, I have outlived them all." A wit, seeing him and Penautier riding in the same carriage, cried out in allusion to this expression, "There go the Cardinal de Bonzy and his star." It was now that the mania for poisoning began to take hold of the popular mind. From this time until the year 1682 the prisons of France teemed with persons accused of this crime, and it is very singular that other offences decreased in a similar proportion. We have already seen the extent to which it was carried in Italy. It was, if possible, surpassed in France. The diabolical ease with which these murders could be effected by means of these scentless and tasteless poisons enticed the evil-minded. Jealousy, revenge, avarice, even petty spite alike resorted to them. Those who would have been deterred by fear of detection from using the pistol or the dagger, or even the strong doses of poison which kill at once, employed slow poisons without dread. The corrupt government of the day, although it could wink at the atrocities of a wealthy and influential courtier like Penautier, was scandalized to see the crime spreading among the people. Disgrace was, in fact, entailed in the eyes of Europe upon the name of Frenchman. Louis XIV, to put a stop to the evil, instituted what was called the Chambre Ardente, or burning chamber, with extensive powers for the trial and punishment of the prisoners. Two women especially made themselves notorious at this time, and were instrumental to the deaths of hundreds of individuals. They both resided in Paris, and were named La Voisin and La Vigoureux. Like Spara and Tophania, of whom they were imitators, they chiefly sold their poisons to women who wanted to get rid of their husbands, and in some few instances to husbands who wanted to get rid of their wives. Their ostensible occupation was that of midwives. They also pretended to be fortune-tellers, and were visited by persons of every class of society. The rich and poor thronged alike to their mansardes to learn the secrets of the future. Their prophecies were principally of death. They foretold to women the approaching dissolution of husbands, and to needy heirs the end of rich relatives, who had made them, as Byron expresses it, wait too long already. They generally took care to be instrumental in fulfilling their own predictions. They used to tell their wretched employers that some sign of approaching death would take place in the house, such as the breaking of glass or china, and they paid servants considerable fees to cause a breakage, as if by accident, exactly at the appointed time. Their occupation as midwives made them acquainted with the secrets of many families, which they afterwards turned to dreadful account. It is not known how long they had carried on this awful trade before they were discovered. Detection finally overtook them at the close of the year 1679. They were both tried, found guilty, and burned alive on the Place de Grève on the 22nd of February, 1680, after their hands had been bored through with a red-hot iron, and then cut off. Their numerous accomplices in Paris and in the provinces were also discovered and brought to trial. According to some authors 30, and to others 50 of them, chiefly women, were hanged in the principal cities. La Voisin kept a list of visitors who came to her house to purchase poisons. This paper was seized by the police on her arrest, and examined by the tribunals. Among the names were found those of the Marshal de Luxembourg, the Countess de Soissons, and the Duchess de Bouillon. The Marshal seems only to have been guilty of a piece of discreditable folly in visiting a woman of this description, but the popular voice at the time imputed to him something more than folly. The author of the Memoirs of the Affairs of Europe since the Peace of Utrecht says, "The miserable gang who dealt in poison and prophecy alleged that he had sold himself to the devil, and that a young girl of the name of Dupin had been poisoned by his means. Among other stories, they said he had made a contract with the devil in order to marry his son to the daughter of the Marquis of Louvois." To this atrocious and absurd accusation the Marshal, who had surrendered himself at the Bastille on the first accusation against him, replied with the mingled sentiment of pride and innocence, "When Methode de Montmorency, my ancestor, married the widow of Louis le Gros, he did not have recourse to the devil, but to the States General, in order to obtain for the minor king the support of the house of Montmorency. This brave man was imprisoned in a cell 6 feet and a half long, and his trial, which was interrupted for several weeks, lasted altogether 14 months. No judgment was pronounced upon him. The Countess of Soissons fled to Brussels rather than undergo the risk of a trial, and was never able to clear herself from the stigma that attached to her of having made an attempt to poison the Queen of Spain by doses of succession powder. The Duchess of Bouillon was arrested and tried by the Chambre Ardente. It would appear, however, that she had nothing to do with the slow poisons, but had merely endeavoured to pry into the secrets of futurity, and gratify her curiosity with a sight of the devil. One of the presidents of the Chambre, La Reynier, an ugly little old man, very seriously asked her whether she had really seen the devil, to which the lady replied, looking him full in the face, "Oh, yes, I see him now. He is in the form of a little ugly old man, exceedingly ill-natured, and is dressed in the robes of a councillor of state." Monsieur La Reynier prudently refrained from asking any more questions of a lady with so sharp and ready a tongue. The Duchess was imprisoned for several months in the Bastille, and nothing being proved against her, she was released at the intercession of her powerful friends. The severe punishment of criminals of this note might have helped to abate the fever of imitation among the vulgar. Their comparative impunity had a contrary tendency. The escape of Penautier and the wealthy Cardinal de Bonzy, his employer, had the most pernicious effect. For 2 years longer the crime continued to rage, and was not finally suppressed till the stake had blazed, or the noose dangled, for upwards of 100 individuals. Footnote: slow poisoning is a crime which has unhappily been revived in England within the last few years, and which has been carried to an extent sufficient to cast a stain upon the national character. The poisoners have been principally women of the lowest class, and their victims have been their husbands or their children. The motive for the crime has in most instances been the basest that can be imagined, the desire to obtain from burial clubs to which they subscribed the premium or burial money. A recent enactment restricting the sale of arsenic and other poisons will, it is to be hoped, check, if it do not extirpate, this abominable crime. 1851. End footnote. End of Chapter 3, Part 3. Recording by Philip Gould.
Chapter 4, Part 1 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, by Charles Mackay, Volume 2, Chapter 4, Haunted Houses, Part 1. Here's a knocking indeed. Knock, knock, knock. Who's there? In the name of Beelzebub. Who's there? In the devil's name. Knock, knock, knock. Never at quiet? Macbeth. Who has not either seen or heard of some house shut up and uninhabitable, fallen into decay, and looking dusty and dreary, from which at midnight strange sounds have been heard to issue, aerial knockings, the rattling of chains, and the groaning of perturbed spirits? A house that people have thought it unsafe to pass after dark, and which has remained for years without a tenant, and which no tenant would occupy, even were he paid to do so. There are hundreds of such houses in England at the present day, hundreds in France, Germany, and almost every country in Europe, which are marked with the mark of fear, places for the timid to avoid, and the pious to bless themselves at, and ask protection from as they pass, the abodes of ghosts and evil spirits. There are many such houses in London, and if any vain boaster of the march of intellect would but take the trouble to find them out and count them, he would be convinced that intellect must yet make some enormous strides before such old superstitions can be eradicated. The idea that such houses exist is a remnant of the witch creed, which merits separate notice from its comparative harmlessness, and from its being not so much a madness as a folly of the people. Unlike other notions that sprang from the belief in witchcraft, and which we have already dwelt upon at sufficient length, it has sent no wretches to the stake or the gibbet, and but a few to the pillory only. Many houses have been condemned as haunted, and avoided by the weak and credulous, from circumstances the most trifling in themselves, and which only wanted a vigorous mind to clear up at once and dissipate all alarm. A house in Aix-la-Chapelle, a large desolate-looking building, remained uninhabited for 5 years, on account of the mysterious knockings that there were heard within it at all hours of the day and night. Nobody could account for the noises, and the fear became at last so excessive that the persons who inhabited the houses on either side relinquished their tenancy and went to reside in other quarters of the town, where there was less chance of interruption from evil spirits. From being so long without an inhabitant, the house at last grew so ruinous, so dingy, and so miserable in its outward appearance, and so like the place that ghosts might be supposed to haunt, that few persons cared to go past it after sunset. The knocking that was heard in one of the upper rooms was not very loud, but it was very regular. The gossips of the neighborhood asserted that they often heard groans from the cellars, and saw lights moved about from one window to another immediately after the midnight bell had tolled. Spectres in white habiliments were reported to have jibed and chattered from the windows, but all these stories could bear no investigation. The knocking, however, was a fact which no one could dispute, and several ineffectual attempts were made by the proprietor to discover the cause. The rooms were sprinkled with holy water. The evil spirits were commanded in due form by a priest to depart thence to the Red Sea, but the knocking still continued in spite of all that could be done in that way. Accident at last discovered the cause and restored tranquillity to the neighborhood. The proprietor, who suffered not only in his mind but in his pocket, had sold the building at a ruinously small price to get rid of all future annoyance. The new proprietor was standing in a room on the first floor when he heard the door driven to at the bottom with a considerable noise, and then fly open immediately, about 2 inches and no more. He stood still a minute and watched, and the same thing occurred a second and a third time. He examined the door attentively, and all the mystery was unraveled. The latch of the door was broken, so that it could not be fastened, and it swung chiefly upon the bottom hinge. Immediately opposite was a window in which one pane of glass was broken, and when the wind was in a certain quarter, the draught of air was so strong that it blew the door to with some violence. There being no latch, it swung open again, and when there was a fresh gust, was again blown to. The new proprietor lost no time in sending for a glazier, and the mysterious noises ceased forever. The house was replastered and repainted, and once more regained its lost good name. It was not before 2 or 3 years, however, that it was thoroughly established in popular favor, and many persons even then would always avoid passing it if they could reach their destination by any other street. A similar story is narrated by Sir Walter Scott in his Letters on Demonology and Witchcraft, the hero of which was a gentleman of birth and distinction, well known in the political world. Shortly after he succeeded to his title and estates, there was a rumor among the servants concerning a strange noise that used to be heard at night in the family mansion, and the cause of which no one could ascertain. The gentleman resolved to discover it himself, and to watch for that purpose with a domestic who had grown old in the family, and who, like the rest, had whispered strange things about the knocking having begun immediately upon the death of his old master. These two watched until the noise was heard, and at last traced it to a small storeroom, used as a place for keeping provisions of various kinds for the family, and of which the old butler had the key. They entered this place, and remained for some time without hearing the noises which they had traced thither. At length the sound was heard, but much lower than it seemed to be while they were farther off, and their imaginations were more excited. They then discovered the cause without difficulty. A rat, caught in an old-fashioned trap, had occasioned the noise by its efforts to escape, in which it was able to raise the trap door of its prison to a certain height, but was then obliged to drop it. The noise of the fall resounding through the house had occasioned the mysterious rumors, which, but for the investigation of the proprietor, would in all probability have acquired so bad a name for the dwelling that no servants would have inhabited it. The circumstance was told to Sir Walter Scott by the gentleman to whom it happened. St. Louis. But in general, houses that have acquired this character have been more indebted for it to the roguery of living men than to accidents like these. 6 monks played off a clever trick of the kind upon that worthy king, Louis, whose piety has procured him in the annals of his own country the designation of the Saint. Having heard his confessor speak in terms of warm eulogy of the goodness and learning of the monks of the order of St. Bruno, he expressed his wish to establish a community of them near Paris. Bernard de la Tour, the superior, sent 6 of the brethren, and the king gave them a handsome house to live in the village of Chantilly. It so happened that from their windows they had a very fine view of the ancient palace of Weir, which had been built for a royal residence by King Robert, but deserted for many years. The worthy monks thought the palace would just suit them, but their modesty was so excessive that they were ashamed to ask the king for a grant of it in due form. This difficulty was not to be overcome, and the monks set their ingenuity to work to discover another plan. The palace of Weir had never labored under any imputation upon its character until they became its neighbors, but somehow or other it almost immediately afterwards began to acquire a bad name. Frightful shrieks were heard to proceed from it at night. Blue, red, and green lights were suddenly seen to glimmer from the windows, and as suddenly to disappear. The clanking of chains was heard, and the howling as of persons in great pain. These disturbances continued for several months, to the great terror of all the country round, and even of the pious King Louis, to whom, at Paris, all the rumors were regularly carried with whole heaps of additions that accumulated on the way. At last a great spectre, clothed all in pea green, with a long white beard and a serpent's tail, took his station regularly at midnight in the principal window of the palace, and howled fearfully and shook his fists at the passengers. The 6 monks at Chantilly, to whom all these things were duly narrated, were exceedingly wrath that the devil should play such antics right opposite their dwelling, and hinted to the commissioners sent down by St. Louis to investigate the matter, that if they were allowed to inhabit the palace, they would very soon make a clearance of the evil spirits. The king was quite charmed with their piety, and expressed to them how grateful he felt for their disinterestedness. A deed was forthwith drawn up, the royal sign manual was affixed to it, and the palace of Weir became the property of the monks of St. Bruno. The deed is dated 1259. The disturbances ceased immediately, the lights disappeared, and the green ghost, so said the monks, was laid at rest forever under the waves of the Red Sea. In the year 1580, one Giel Blacher had taken the lease of a house in the suburbs of Tours, but repenting him of his bargain with the landlord, Peter Piquet, he endeavored to prevail upon him to cancel the agreement. Peter, however, was satisfied with his tenant and his terms, and would listen to no compromise. Very shortly afterwards the rumor was spread all over Tours that the house of Giel Blacher was haunted. Giel himself asserted that he verily believed his house to be the general rendezvous of all the witches and evil spirits of France. The noise they made was awful, and quite prevented him from sleeping. They knocked against the wall, howled in the chimneys, and broke his window glass, scattered his pots and pans all over his kitchen, and set his chairs and tables a-dancing the whole night through. Crowds of persons assembled round the house to hear the mysterious noises, and the bricks were observed to detach themselves from the wall, and fall into the streets upon the heads of those who had not said their paternoster before coming out in the morning. These things having continued for some time, Giel Blacher made his complaint to the civil court of Tours, and Peter Piquet was summoned to shew cause why the lease should not be annulled. Poor Peter could make no defense, and the court unanimously agreed that no lease could hold under such circumstances, and annulled it accordingly, condemning the unlucky owner to all the expenses of the suit. Peter appealed to the Parliament of Paris, and after a long examination the Parliament confirmed the lease. "Not," said the judge, "because it has been fully and satisfactorily proved that the house is troubled by evil spirits, but that there was an informality in the proceedings before the civil court of Tours that rendered its decision null and of no effect." A similar cause was tried before the Parliament of Bordeaux in the year 1595, relative to a house in that city which was sorely troubled by evil spirits. The Parliament appointed certain ecclesiastics to examine and report to them, and on their report in the affirmative that the house was haunted, the lease was annulled and the tenant absolved from all payment of rent and taxes. One of the best stories of a haunted house is that of the royal palace of Woodstock, in the year 1649, when the commissioners sent from London by the Long Parliament to take possession of it, and efface all the emblems of royalty about it, were fairly driven out by their fear of the devil, and the annoyances they suffered from a roguish cavalier who played the imp to admiration. The commissioners, dreading at that time no devil, arrived at Woodstock on the 13th of October, 1649. They took up their lodgings in the late king's apartments, turned the beautiful bedrooms and withdrawing rooms into kitchens and sculleries, the council hall into a brewhouse, and made the dining room a place to keep firewood in. They pulled down all the insignia of royal state, and treated with the utmost indignity everything that recalled to their memory the name or the majesty of Charles Stuart. One Giles Sharp accompanied them in the capacity of clerk, and seconded their efforts, apparently with the greatest zeal. He aided them to uproot a noble old tree, merely because it was called the King's Oak, and tossed the fragments into the dining room to make cheerful fires for the commissioners. During the first 2 days they heard some strange noises about the house, but they paid no great attention to them. On the 3rd, however, they began to suspect they had got into bad company, for they heard, as they thought, a supernatural dog under their bed, which gnawed their bedclothes. On the next day the chairs and tables began to dance, apparently of their own accord. On the 5th day something came into the bedchamber, and walked up and down, and fetching the warming pan out of the withdrawing room, made so much noise with it that they thought 5 church bells were ringing in their ears. On the 6th day the plates and dishes were thrown up and down the dining room. On the 7th they penetrated into the bedroom in company with several logs of wood, and usurped the soft pillows intended for the commissioners. On the 8th and 9th nights there was a cessation of hostilities, but on the 10th the bricks in the chimneys became locomotive, and rattled and danced about the floors and round the heads of the commissioners all the night long. On the 11th the demon ran away with their breeches, and on the 12th filled their beds so full of pewter platters that they could not get into them. On the 13th night the glass became unaccountably seized with a fit of cracking, and fell into shivers in all parts of the house. On the 14th there was a noise as if 40 pieces of artillery had been fired off, and a shower of pebble stones, which so alarmed the commissioners that, struck with great horror, they cried out to one another for help. They first of all tried the efficacy of prayers to drive away the evil spirits, but these proving unavailing, they began seriously to reflect whether it would not be much better to leave the place altogether to the devils that inhabited it. They ultimately resolved, however, to try it a little longer, and having craved forgiveness of all their sins, betook themselves to bed. That night they slept in tolerable comfort, but it was merely a trick of their tormentor to lull them into false security. When, on the succeeding night, they heard no noises, they began to flatter themselves that the devil was driven out, and prepared accordingly to take up their quarters for the whole winter in the palace. These symptoms on their part became the signal for renewed uproar among the fiends. On the 1st of November, they heard something walking with a slow and solemn pace up and down the withdrawing room, and immediately afterwards a shower of stones, bricks, mortar, and broken glass pelted about their ears. On the 2nd, the steps were again heard in the withdrawing room, sounding to their fancy very much like the treading of an enormous bear, which continued for about a quarter of an hour. This noise having ceased, a large warming pan was thrown violently upon the table, followed by a number of stones and the jawbone of a horse. Some of the boldest walked valiantly into the withdrawing room, armed with swords and pistols, but could discover nothing. They were afraid that night to go to sleep, and sat up making fires in every room, and burning candles and lamps in great abundance, thinking that, as the fiends loved darkness, they would not disturb a company surrounded with so much light. They were deceived, however. Buckets of water came down the chimneys and extinguished the fires, and the candles were blown out, they knew not how. Some of the servants who had betaken themselves to bed were drenched with putrid ditch water as they lay, and arose in great fright, muttering incoherent prayers, and exposing to the wondering eyes of the commissioners their linen all dripping with green moisture, and their knuckles red with the blows they had at the same time received from some invisible tormentors. While they were still speaking, there was a noise like the loudest thunder, or the firing of a whole park of artillery, upon which they all fell down upon their knees and implored the protection of the Almighty. One of the commissioners then arose, the others still kneeling, and asked in a courageous voice, and in the name of God, who was there, and what they had done that they should be troubled in that manner. No answer was returned, and the noises ceased for a while. At length, however, as the commissioner said, the devil came again, and brought with it 7 devils worse than itself. Being again in darkness, they lighted a candle and placed it in the doorway, that it might throw a light upon the 2 chambers at once. But it was suddenly blown out, and one commissioner said that he had seen the similitude of a horse's hoof striking the candle and candlestick into the middle of the chamber, and afterwards making 3 scrapes on the snuff to put it out. Upon this the same person was so bold as to draw his sword, but he asserted positively that he had hardly withdrawn it from the scabbard before an invisible hand seized hold of it, and tugged with him for it, and prevailing, struck him so violent a blow with the pommel that he was quite stunned. Then the noises began again, upon which, with one accord, they all retired into the presence chamber, where they passed the night, praying and singing psalms. They were by this time convinced that it was useless to struggle any longer with the powers of evil that seemed determined to make Woodstock their own. These things happened on the Saturday night, and being repeated on the Sunday, they determined to leave the place immediately and return to London. By Tuesday morning early, all their preparations were completed, and shaking the dust off their feet, and devoting Woodstock and all its inhabitants to the infernal gods, they finally took their departure. Many years elapsed before the true cause of these disturbances was discovered. It was ascertained at the Restoration that the whole was the work of Giles Sharp, the trusty clerk of the commissioners. This man, whose real name was Joseph Collins, was a concealed royalist, and had passed his early life within the bowers of Woodstock, so that he knew every hole and corner of the place, and the numerous trap-doors and secret passages that abounded in the building. The commissioners, never suspecting the true state of his opinions, but believing him to be revolutionary to the backbone, placed the utmost reliance upon him, a confidence which he abused in the manner above detailed, to his own great amusement and that of the few cavaliers whom he let into the secret. End of chapter 4, part 1. Recording by Bill Moseley, Llano County, Texas, USA. Chapter 4, part 2 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Moseley. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay, Volume 2, Chapter 4, Haunted Houses, Part 2. Quite as extraordinary and as cleverly managed was the trick played off at Tedworth in 1661 at the house of Mr. Mompesson, and which is so circumstantially narrated by the Reverend Joseph Glanville under the title of The Demon of Tedworth, and appended, among other proofs of witchcraft, to his noted work called Sadducismus Triumphatus. About the middle of April, in the year above mentioned, Mr. Mompesson, having returned to his house at Tedworth from a journey he had taken to London, was informed by his wife that during his absence they had been troubled with the most extraordinary noises. 3 nights afterwards he heard the noise himself, and it appeared to him to be that of "a great knocking at his doors, and on the outside of his walls." He immediately arose, dressed himself, took down a pair of pistols, and walked valiantly forth to discover the disturber, under the impression that it must be a robber. But as he went, the noise seemed to travel before or behind him, and when he arrived at the door from which he thought it proceeded, he saw nothing, but still heard "a strange hollow sound." He puzzled his brains for a long time, and searched every corner of the house, but discovering nothing, he went to bed again. He was no sooner snug under the clothes than the noise began again more furiously than ever, sounding very much like a "thumping and drumming on the top of his house, and then by degrees going off into the air." These things continued for several nights, when it came to the recollection of Mr. Mompesson that some time before he had given orders for the arrest and imprisonment of a wandering drummer, who went about the country with a large drum, disturbing quiet people and soliciting alms, and that he had detained the man's drum, and that probably the drummer was a wizard, and had sent evil spirits to haunt his house to be revenged of him. He became strengthened in his opinion every day, especially when the noises assumed, to his fancy, a resemblance to the beating of a drum, "like that at the breaking up of a guard." Mrs. Mompesson being brought to bed, the devil or the drummer very kindly and considerately refrained from making the usual riot, but as soon as she recovered strength, began again, "in a ruder manner than before, following and vexing the young children, and beating their bedsteads with so much violence that every one expected they would fall into pieces." For an hour together, as the worthy Mr. Mompesson repeated to his wondering neighbors, this infernal drummer "would beat Roundheads and Cuckolds, the tattoo, and several other points of war, as cleverly as any soldier." When this had lasted long enough, he changed his tactics, and scratched with his iron talons under the children's bed. "On the 5th of November," says the Reverend Joseph Glanville, "it made a mighty noise, and a servant observing two boards in the children's room seeming to move, he bid it give him one of them, upon which the board came, nothing moving it that he saw, within a yard of him. The man added, 'Nay, let me have it in my hand,' upon which the spirit, devil, or drummer, pushed it towards him so close that he might touch it. This," continues Glanville, "was in the daytime, and was seen by a whole room full of people. That morning it left a sulphureous smell behind it, which was very offensive. At night the minister, one Mr. Cragg, and several of the neighbors came to the house on a visit. Mr. Cragg went to prayers with them, kneeling at the children's bedside, where it then became very troublesome and loud. During prayer time the spirit withdrew into the cockloft, and returning as soon as prayers were done, and then, in spite of the company, the chairs walked about the room of themselves, the children's shoes were hurled over their heads, and every loose thing moved about the chamber. At the same time, a bedstaff was thrown at the minister, which hit him on the leg, but so favorably that a lock of wool could not have fallen more softly." On another occasion, the blacksmith of the village, a fellow who cared neither for ghost nor devil, slept with John the footman, that he also might hear the disturbances, and be cured of his incredulity, when there "came a noise in the room as if one had been shoeing a horse, and somewhat came as it were with a pair of pincers," snipping and snapping at the poor blacksmith's nose the greater part of the night. Next day it came panting like a dog out of breath, upon which some woman present took a bedstaff to knock at it, "which was caught suddenly out of her hand and thrown away, and company coming up, the room was presently filled with a bloomy noisome smell, and was very hot, though without fire, in a very sharp and severe winter. It continued in the bed, panting and scratching for an hour and a half, and then went into the next room, where it knocked a little, and seemed to rattle a chain." The rumor of these wonderful occurrences soon spread all over the country, and people from far and near flocked to the haunted house of Tedworth, to believe or doubt as their natures led them, but all filled with intense curiosity. It appears, too, that the fame of these events reached the royal ear, and that some gentlemen were sent by the king to investigate the circumstances, and draw up a report of what they saw or heard. Whether the royal commissioners were more sensible men than the neighbors of Mr. Mompesson, and required more clear and positive evidence than they, or whether the powers with which they were armed to punish any body who might be found carrying on this deception, frightened the evildoers, is not certain; but Glanville himself reluctantly confesses that all the time they were in the house the noises ceased, and nothing was heard or seen. "However," says he, "as to the quiet of the house when the courtiers were there, the intermission may have been accidental, or perhaps the demon was not willing to give so public a testimony of those transactions which might possibly convince those who he had rather should continue in unbelief of his existence." As soon as the royal commissioners took their departure, the infernal drummer recommenced his antics, and hundreds of persons were daily present to hear and wonder. Mr. Maupassant's servant was so fortunate as not only to hear, but to see this pertinacious demon, for it came and stood at the foot of his bed. "The exact shape and proportion of it he could not discover, but he saw a great body with two red and glaring eyes, which for some time were fixed steadily on him, and at length disappeared." Innumerable were the antics it played. Once it purred like a cat, beat the children's legs black and blue, put a long spike into Mr. Maupassant's bed, and a knife into his mother's, filled the porringers with ashes, hid a Bible under the grate, and turned the money black in people's pockets. "One night," said Mr. Maupassant in a letter to Mr. Glanville, "there were 7 or 8 of these devils in the shape of men, who as soon as a gun was fired would shuffle away into an arbor," a circumstance which might have convinced Mr. Maupassant of the mortal nature of his persecutors, if he had not been of the number of those worse than blind, who shut their eyes and refuse to see. In the meantime, the drummer, the supposed cause of all the mischief, passed his time in Gloucester jail, whither he had been committed as a rogue and a vagabond. Being visited one day by some person from the neighbourhood of Tedworth, he asked what was the news in Wiltshire, and whether people did not talk a great deal about a drumming in a gentleman's house there. The visitor replied that he heard of nothing else, upon which the drummer observed, "I have done it. I have thus plagued him, and he shall never be quiet until he hath made me satisfaction for taking away my drum." No doubt the fellow, who seems to have been a gipsy, spoke the truth, and that the gang of which he was a member knew more about the noises at Mr. Maupassant's house than anybody else. Upon these words, however, he was brought to trial at Salisbury for witchcraft, and, being found guilty, was sentenced to transportation, a sentence which, for its leniency, excited no little wonder in that age, when such an accusation, whether proved or not, generally insured the stake or the gibbet. Glanville says that the noises ceased immediately the drummer was sent beyond the seas, but that somehow or other he managed to return from transportation, "by raising storms and affrighting the seamen, it was said," when the disturbances were forthwith renewed, and continued at intervals for several years. Certainly, if the confederates of this roving gipsy were so pertinacious in tormenting poor weak Mr. Maupassant, their pertinacity is a most extraordinary instance of what revenge is capable of. It was believed by many at the time that Mr. Maupassant himself was privy to the whole matter, and permitted and encouraged these tricks in his house for the sake of notoriety; but it seems more probable that the gypsies were the real delinquents, and that Mr. Maupassant was as much alarmed and bewildered as his credulous neighbors, whose excited imaginations conjured up no small portion of these stories, "which rolled, and as they rolled grew larger visibly." Many instances of a similar kind, during the 17th century, might be gleaned from Glanville and other writers of that period, but they do not differ sufficiently from these to justify a detail of them. The most famous of all haunted houses acquired its notoriety much nearer our own time, and the circumstances connected with it are so curious, and afford so fair a specimen of the easy credulity even of well-informed and sensible people, as to merit a little notice in this chapter. The Cock Lane Ghosts, as it was called, kept London in commotion for a considerable time, and was the theme of conversation among the learned and the illiterate, and in every circle, from that of the prince to that of the peasant. End of chapter 4, part 2. Recording by Bill Moseley, Llano County, Texas, USA.
Chapter 4, Part 3 of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay, Volume 2. Chapter 4, Haunted Houses, Part 3. At the commencement of the year 1760, there resided in Cock Lane, near West Smithfield, in the house of one Parsons, the parish clerk of St. Sepulchre's, a stockbroker named Kent. The wife of this gentleman had died in childbed during the previous year, and his sister-in-law, Miss Fanny, had arrived from Norfolk to keep his house for him. They soon conceived a mutual affection, and each of them made a will in the other's favour. They lived some months in the house of Parsons, who, being a needy man, borrowed money of his lodger. Some difference arose betwixt them, and Mr. Kent left the house, and instituted legal proceedings against the parish clerk for the recovery of his money. While this matter was yet pending, Miss Fanny was suddenly taken ill of the smallpox, and, notwithstanding every care and attention, she died in a few days, and was buried in a vault under Clerkenwell Church. Parsons now began to hint that the poor lady had come unfairly by her death, and that Mr. Kent was accessory to it, from his too great eagerness to enter into possession of the property she had bequeathed him. Nothing further was said for nearly 2 years, but it would appear that Parsons was of so revengeful a character that he had never forgotten or forgiven his differences with Mr. Kent, and the indignity of having been sued for the borrowed money. The strong passions of pride and avarice were silently at work during all that interval, hatching schemes of revenge, but dismissing them one after the other as impracticable, until at last a notable one suggested itself. About the beginning of the year 1762, the alarm was spread over all the neighbourhood of Cock Lane that the house of Parsons was haunted by the ghost of poor Fanny, and that the daughter of Parsons, a girl about 12 years of age, had several times seen and conversed with the spirit, who had, moreover, informed her that she had not died of the smallpox, as was currently reported, but of poison administered by Mr. Kent. Parsons, who originated, took good care to countenance these reports, and in answer to numerous inquiries, said his house was every night, and had been for 2 years, in fact, ever since the death of Fanny, troubled by a loud knocking at the doors and in the walls. Having thus prepared the ignorant and credulous neighbours to believe or exaggerate for themselves what he had told them, he sent for a gentleman of a higher class in life to come and witness these extraordinary occurrences. The gentleman came accordingly, and found the daughter of Parsons, to whom the spirit alone appeared, and whom alone it answered, in bed, trembling violently, having just seen the ghost, and been again informed that she had died from poison. A loud knocking was also heard from every part of the chamber, which so mystified the not very clear understanding of the visitor that he departed, afraid to doubt and ashamed to believe, but with a promise to bring the clergyman of the parish and several other gentlemen on the following day to report upon the mystery. On the following night he returned, bringing with him 3 clergymen and about 20 other persons, including 2 negroes, when, upon a consultation with Parsons, they resolved to sit up the whole night and await the ghost's arrival. It was then explained by Parsons that, although the ghost would never render itself visible to anybody but his daughter, it had no objection to answer the questions that might be put to it by any person present, and that it expressed an affirmation by 1 knock, a negative by 2, and its displeasure by a kind of scratching. The child was then put into bed along with her sister, and the clergyman examined the bed and bedclothes to satisfy themselves that no trick was played by knocking upon any substance concealed among the clothes. As on the previous night, the bed was observed to shake violently. Footnote: the woman whose ghost was said to manifest itself in Cock Lane was buried in the crypt or cloister of St. John, Clerkenwell. The vault is composed of 2 aisles, that on the south being much narrower than the other. It was here she was deposited. About 7 years since, I was sketching a picturesque trefoil-headed door leading into this part of the vault, and the place being at that time in great confusion with coffins, remains of bodies, some of which were dried like mummies, etc., I could find no better seat than one of the coffins. The sexton's boy, who held my light, informed me this was the coffin of Scratching Fanny, which recalled the Cock Lane story to my mind. I got off the lid of the coffin, and saw the face of a handsome woman, with an aquiline nose, this feature remaining perfect, an uncommon case, for the cartilage mostly gives way. The remains had become adipocere, and were perfectly preserved. She was said to have been poisoned by deleterious punch, but this was legally disproved, and, if I remember rightly, she was otherwise declared to have died of smallpox. Of this disease there was not the least sign, but as some mineral poisons tend to render bodies adipocere, here was some evidence in support of the former allegation. I made particular inquiries at the time of Mr. Bird, churchwarden, a respectable and judicious man, and he gave me good assurance that this coffin had always been looked upon as the one containing the Cock Lane woman. Since that time the vault has been set in order, and the above-mentioned coffin, with others, put away. The niche near the window in the drawing of the ghost room is the place where the bedhead was, and where the scratching, knocks, etc., were heard. This is the tradition of the house. Mrs. King, who holds the premises, informs me that her family has had the house about 80 years. J. W. Archer. End footnote. After some hours, during which they all waited with exemplary patience, the mysterious knocking was heard in the wall, and the child declared that she saw the ghost of poor Fanny. The following questions were then gravely put by the clergyman, through the medium of one Mary Fraser, the servant of Parsons, and to whom it was said the deceased lady had been much attached. The answers were in the usual fashion, by a knock or knocks. "Do you make this disturbance on account of the ill usage you received from Mr. Kent?" "Yes." "Were you brought to an untimely end by poison?" "Yes." "How was the poison administered, in beer or purl?" In pearl. How long was that before your death? About 3 hours. Can your former servant, Carrots, give any information about the poison? Yes. Are you Kent's wife's sister? Yes. Were you married to Kent after your sister's death? No. Was anybody else besides Kent concerned in your murder? No. Can you, if you like, appear visibly to anyone? Yes. Will you do so? Yes. Can you go out of this house? Yes. Is it your intention to follow this child about everywhere? Yes. Are you pleased in being asked these questions? Yes. Does it ease your troubled soul? Yes. Here there was heard a mysterious noise, which some wiseacre present compared to the fluttering of wings. How long before your death did you tell your servant Carrots that you were poisoned? An hour? Yes. Carrots, who was present, was appealed to, but she stated positively that such was not the fact, as the deceased was quite speechless an hour before her death. This shook the faith of some of the spectators, but the examination was allowed to continue. How long did Carrots live with you? 3 or 4 days. Carrots was again appealed to, and said that this was true. If Mr. Kent is arrested for this murder, will he confess? Yes. Would your soul be at rest if he were hanged for it? Yes. Will he be hanged for it? Yes. How long a time first? 3 years. How many clergymen are there in this room? 3. How many negroes? 2. Is this watch held up by one of the clergymen white? No. Is it yellow? No. Is it blue? No. Is it black? Yes. The watch was in a black shagreen case. At what time this morning will you take your departure? The answer to this question was 4 knocks, very distinctly heard by every person present, and accordingly at 4 o'clock precisely the ghost took its departure to the Wheatsheaf public-house close by, where it frightened mine host and his lady almost out of their wits by knocking in the ceiling right above their bed. The rumour of these occurrences very soon spread over London, and every day Cock Lane was rendered impassable by the crowds of people who assembled around the house of the parish clerk, in expectation of either seeing the ghost or of hearing the mysterious knocks. It was at last found necessary, so clamorous were they for admission within the haunted precincts, to admit those only who would pay a certain fee, an arrangement which was very convenient to the needy and money-loving Mr. Parsons. Indeed, things had taken a turn greatly to his satisfaction. He not only had his revenge, but he made a profit out of it. The ghost, in consequence, played its antics every night to the great amusement of many hundreds of people, and the great perplexity of a still greater number. Unhappily, however, for the parish clerk, the ghost was induced to make some promises, which were the means of utterly destroying its reputation. It promised, in answer to the questions of the Reverend Mr. Aldrich of Clerkenwell, that it would not only follow the little Miss Parsons wherever she went, but would also attend him, or any other gentleman, into the vault under St. John's Church, where the body of the murdered woman was deposited, and would there give notice of its presence by a distinct knock upon the coffin. As a preliminary, the girl was conveyed to the house of Mr. Aldrich, near the church, where a large party of ladies and gentlemen, eminent for their acquirements, their rank, or their wealth, had assembled. About 10 o'clock on the night of the 1st of February, the girl, having been brought from Cock Lane in a coach, was put to bed by several ladies in the house of Mr. Aldrich. a strict examination having been previously made that nothing was hidden in the bedclothes. While the gentlemen in an adjoining chamber were deliberating whether they should proceed in a body to the vault, they were summoned into the bedroom by the ladies, who affirmed in great alarm that the ghost was come, and that they heard the knocks and scratches. The gentlemen entered accordingly, with a determination to suffer no deception. The little girl, on being asked whether she saw the ghost, replied, "No, but she felt it on her back like a mouse." She was then required to put her hands out of bed, and they being held by some of the ladies, the spirit was summoned in the usual manner to answer if it were in the room. The question was several times put with great solemnity, but the customary knock was not heard in reply in the walls, neither was there any scratching. The ghost was then asked to render itself visible, but it did not choose to grant the request. It was next solicited to give some token of its presence by a sound of any sort, or by touching the hand or cheek of any lady or gentleman in the room, but even with this request the ghost would not comply. There was now a considerable pause, and one of the clergymen went downstairs to interrogate the father of the girl, who was waiting the result of the experiment. He positively denied that there was any deception, and even went so far as to say that he himself, upon one occasion, had seen and conversed with the awful ghost. This having been communicated to the company, it was unanimously resolved to give the ghost another trial, and the clergyman called out in a loud voice to the supposed spirit that the gentleman to whom it had promised to appear in the vault was about to repair to that place, where he claimed the fulfilment of its promise. At 1 hour after midnight they all proceeded to the church, and the gentleman in question, with another, entered the vault alone, and took up their position alongside of the coffin of poor Fanny. The ghost was then summoned to appear, but it appeared not. It was summoned to knock, but it knocked not. It was summoned to scratch, but it scratched not. And the two retired from the vault, with a firm belief that the whole business was a deception practised by Parsons and his daughter. There were others, however, who did not wish to jump so hastily to a conclusion, and who suggested that they were perhaps trifling with this awful and supernatural being, which, being offended with them for their presumption, would not condescend to answer them. Again, after serious consultation, it was agreed on all hands that if the ghost answered anybody at all, it would answer Mr. Kent, the supposed murderer, and he was accordingly requested to go down into the vault. He went with several others, and summoned the ghost to answer whether he had indeed poisoned her. There being no answer, the question was put by Mr. Aldrich, who conjured it, if it were indeed a spirit, to end their doubts, make a sign of its presence, and point out the guilty person. There being still no answer for the space of half an hour, during which time all these boobies waited with the most praiseworthy perseverance, they returned to the house of Mr. Aldrich, and ordered the girl to get up and dress herself. She was strictly examined, but persisted in her statement that she used no deception, and that the ghost had really appeared to her. So many persons had, by their openly expressed belief of the reality of the visitation, identified themselves with it, that Parsons and his family were far from being the only persons interested in the continuance of the delusion. The result of the experiment convinced most people, but these were not to be convinced by any evidence, however positive, and they therefore spread abroad the rumour that the ghost had not appeared in the vault, because Mr. Kent had taken care beforehand to have the coffin removed. That gentleman, whose position was a very painful one, immediately procured competent witnesses, in whose presence the vault was entered, and the coffin of poor Fanny opened. Their depositions were then published, and Mr. Kent indicted Parsons and his wife, his daughter, Mary Fraser the servant, the Reverend Mr. Moore, and a tradesman, two of the most prominent patrons of the deception, for a conspiracy. The trial came on in the Court of King's Bench on the 10th of July, before Lord Chief Justice Mansfield, when, after an investigation which lasted 12 hours, the whole of the conspirators were found guilty. The Reverend Mr. Moore and his friend were severely reprimanded in open court, and recommended to make some pecuniary compensation to the prosecutor for the aspersions they had been instrumental in throwing upon his character. Parsons was sentenced to stand 3 times in the pillory, and to be imprisoned for 2 years, his wife to 1 year's, and his servant to 6 months' imprisonment in the Bridewell. A printer, who had been employed by them to publish an account of the proceedings for their profit, was also fined £50 and discharged. The precise manner in which the deception was carried on has never been explained. The knocking in the wall appears to have been the work of Parsons' wife, while the scratching part of the business was left to the little girl. That any contrivance so clumsy could have deceived anybody cannot fail to excite our wonder, but thus it always is. If 2 or 3 persons can only be found to take the lead in any absurdity, however great, there is sure to be plenty of imitators. Like sheep in a field, if one clears the stile, the rest will follow. About 10 years afterwards, London was again alarmed by the story of a haunted house. Stockwell, near Vauxhall, the scene of the antics of this new ghost, became almost as celebrated in the annals of superstition as Cock Lane. Mrs. Golding, an elderly lady who resided alone with her servant, Anne Robinson, was sorely surprised on the evening of Twelfth Day, 1772, to observe a most extraordinary commotion among her crockery. Cups and saucers rattled down the chimney. Pots and pans were whirled downstairs or through the windows, and hams, cheeses, and loaves of bread disported themselves upon the floor as if the devil were in them. This, at least, was the conclusion that Mrs. Golding came to, and being greatly alarmed, she invited some of her neighbours to stay with her and protect her from the evil one. Their presence, however, did not put a stop to the insurrection of china, and every room in the house was, in a short time, strewed with the fragments. The chairs and tables joined at last in the tumult, and things looked altogether so serious and inexplicable that the neighbours, dreading that the house itself would next be seized with a fit of motion and tumble about their ears, left poor Mrs. Golding to bear the brunt of it by herself. The ghost in this case was solemnly remonstrated with, and urged to take its departure, but the demolition continuing as great as before, Mrs. Golding finally made up her mind to quit the house altogether. She took refuge with Anne Robinson in the house of a neighbour, but his glass and crockery being immediately subjected to the same persecution, he was reluctantly compelled to give her notice to quit. The old lady, thus forced back to her own house, endured the disturbance for some days longer, when, suspecting that Anne Robinson was the cause of all the mischief, she dismissed her from her service. The extraordinary appearances immediately ceased, and were never afterwards renewed, a fact which is of itself sufficient to point out the real disturber. A long time afterwards, Anne Robinson confessed the whole matter to the Reverend Mr. Brayfield. This gentleman confided the story to Mr. Hone, who has published an explanation of the mystery. Anne, it appears, was anxious to have a clear house, to carry on an intrigue with her lover, and resorted to this trick to effect her purpose. She placed the china on the shelves in such a manner that it fell on the slightest motion, and attached horse-hairs to other articles, so that she could jerk them down from an adjoining room without being perceived by any one. She was exceedingly dexterous at this sort of work, and would have proved a formidable rival to many a juggler by profession. A full explanation of the whole affair may be found in the Everyday Book. The latest instance of the popular panic occasioned by a house supposed to be haunted, occurred in Scotland in the winter of the year 1838. On the 5th of December, the inmates of the farmhouse of Baldarroch in the district of Banchory, Aberdeenshire, were alarmed by observing a great number of sticks, pebble stones, and clods of earth flying about their yard and premises. They endeavoured, but in vain, to discover who was the delinquent, and the shower of stones continuing for 5 days in succession, they came at last to the conclusion that the devil and his imps were alone the cause of it. The rumour soon spread over all that part of the country, and hundreds of persons came from far and near to witness the antics of the devils of Baldarroch. After the 5th day, the shower of clods and stones ceased on the outside of the premises, and the scene shifted to the interior. Spoons, knives, plates, mustard pots, rolling pins, and flat irons appeared suddenly endued with the power of self-motion, and were whirled from room to room and rattled down the chimneys in a manner which nobody could account for. The lid of a mustard pot was put into a cupboard by the servant girl in the presence of scores of people, and in a few minutes afterwards came bouncing down the chimney, to the consternation of everybody. There was also a tremendous knocking at the doors and on the roof, and pieces of stick and pebble stones rattled against the windows and broke them. The whole neighbourhood was a scene of alarm, and not only the vulgar, but persons of education, respectable farmers within a circle of 20 miles, expressed their belief in the supernatural character of these events, and offered up devout prayers to be preserved from the machinations of the evil one. The note of fear being once sounded, the visitors, as is generally the case in all tales of wonder, strove with each other who should witness the most extraordinary occurrences, and within a week it was generally believed in the parishes of Banchory Turnin, Drumoak, Duris, Kincardine O'Neill, and all the circumjacent districts of Mearns and Aberdeenshire, that the devil had been seen in the act of hammering upon the housetop of Baldarroch. One old man asserted positively that one night, after having been to see the strange gambols of the knives and mustard pots, he met the phantom of a great black man, "who wheeled round his head with a whizzing noise, making a wind about his ears that almost blew his bonnet off," and that he was haunted by him in this manner for 3 miles. It was also affirmed and believed that all horses and dogs that approached this enchanted ground were immediately affected; that a gentleman, slow of faith, had been cured of his incredulity by meeting the butter churn, jumping in at the door as he himself was going out; that the roofs of houses had been torn off, and that several ricks in the cornyard had danced a quadrille together, to the sound of the devil's bagpipes re-echoing from the mountain-tops. The women in the family of the persecuted farmer of Baldarroch also kept their tongues in perpetual motion, swelling with their strange stories the tide of popular wonder. The good wife herself and all her servants said that whenever they went to bed they were attacked with stones and other missiles, some of which came below the blankets and gently tapped their toes. One evening a shoe suddenly darted across a garret where some labourers were sitting, and one of the men who attempted to catch it swore positively that it was so hot and heavy he was unable to hold it. It was also said that the bear-beater, a sort of mortar used to bruise barley in, an object of such weight that it requires several men to move it, spontaneously left the barn and flew over the housetop, alighting at the feet of one of the servant-maids, and hitting her, but without hurting her in the least, or even causing her any alarm, it being a fact well known to her that all objects thus thrown about by the devil lost their specific gravity and could harm nobody, even though they fell upon a person's head. Among the persons drawn to Baldarroch by these occurrences were the heritor, the minister, and all the elders of the kirk, under whose superintendence an investigation was immediately commenced. Their proceedings were not promulgated for some days, and in the meantime rumor continued to travel through all the Highlands, magnifying each mysterious incident the farther it got from home. It was said that when the good wife put her potato pot on the fire, each potato, as the water boiled, changed into a demon, and grinned horribly at her as she lifted the lid. That not only chairs and tables, but carrots and turnips skipped along the floor in the merriest manner imaginable. That shoes and boots went through all the evolutions of the Highland fling without any visible wearers directing their motions, and that a piece of meat detached itself from the hook on which it hung in the pantry, and placed itself before the fire, whence all the efforts of the people of the house were unable to remove it until it was thoroughly roasted, and that it then flew up the chimney with a tremendous bang. At Baldarroch itself the belief was not quite so extravagant, but the farmer was so convinced that the devil and his imps were alone the cause of all the disturbance, that he travelled a distance of 40 miles to an old conjurer named Willie Foreman, to induce him, for a handsome fee, to remove the enchantment from his property. There were, of course, some sensible and educated people who, after stripping the stories circulated of their exaggeration, attributed all the rest to one or other of two causes. First, that some gipsies or strolling mendicants, hidden in the neighbouring plantation, were amusing themselves by working on the credulity of the country people; or, secondly, that the inmates of Baldarroch carried on this deception themselves, for some reason or other which was not very clear to anybody. The last opinion gained but few believers, as the farmer and his family were much respected, and so many persons had, in the most open manner, expressed their belief in the supernatural agency, that they did not like to stultify themselves by confessing that they had been deceived. At last, after a fortnight's continuance of the noises, the whole trick was discovered. The two servant lasses were strictly examined, and then committed to prison. It appeared that they were alone at the bottom of the whole affair, and that the extraordinary alarm and credulity of their master and mistress in the first instance, and of the neighbours and country people afterwards, made their task comparatively easy. A little common dexterity was all they had used, and, being themselves unsuspected, they swelled the alarm by the wonderful stories they invented. It was they who loosened the bricks in the chimneys, and placed the dishes in such a manner on the shelves that they fell on the slightest motion. In short, they played the same tricks as those used by the servant girl at Stockwell, with the same results, and for the same purpose, the gratification of a love of mischief. They were no sooner secured in the county jail than the noises ceased, and most people were convinced that human agency alone had worked all the wonder. Some few of the most devoutly superstitious still held out in their first belief, and refused to listen to any explanation. These tales of haunted houses, especially those of the last and present century, however they may make us blush for popular folly, are yet gratifying in their results, for they show that society has made a vast improvement. Had Parsons and his wife, and the other contrivers of the Cock Lane deception, lived 200 years earlier, they would not perhaps have found a greater number of dupes, but they would have been hanged as witches, instead of being imprisoned as vagabonds. The ingenious Anne Robinson and the sly lasses of Baldarroch would doubtless have met a similar fate. Thus it is pleasant to reflect that though there may be as much folly and credulity in the world as ever in one class of society, there is more wisdom and mercy in another than ever were known before. Lawgivers, by blotting from the statute book the absurd or sanguinary enactments of their predecessors, have made one step towards teaching the people. It is to be hoped that the day is not far distant when lawgivers will teach the people by some more direct means, and prevent the recurrence of delusions like these, and many worse, which might be cited, by securing to every child born within their dominions an education in accordance with the advancing state of civilization. If ghosts and witches are not yet altogether exploded, it is the fault not so much of the ignorant people as of the law and the government that have neglected to enlighten them. End of Chapter 4, Part 2. Recording by Linda Johnson.